Welcome to the video. We're going to work in Flow Designer to create a custom BigQuery spoke. We're going to go over Flow Designer basics and Integration Hub at a high level. We're going to create spoke actions in Flow Designer, subflows that leverage those spoke actions, and flows that leverage those subflows. We will also touch on importing data from BigQuery using our custom spoke through import sets and transform maps. There are other ways to go about importing data through REST data sources and data stream data sources. REST data sources are very limited on pagination and could potentially be used, but it will not work for our use case in this situation. Data stream data sources have better customization functionality and pagination, but this requires a subscription to IntegrationHub Enterprise. We will be skipping this option in this video. So let's get to it. Alright, so let's go over our use case here. I have my PDI up here, I have customer service installed, and let's say I want to populate the accounts table with an external source. So in our use case, it's going to be BigQuery. So right now, I don't have any accounts in the customer table in ServiceNow. What we want to do is in our Google BigQuery database that we have set up. Let's go here. Ooh. And let's say I have a table here for vendors, and then this could be being populated from other external sources into this main database here. We'll say this is our source of truth. There's not many fields on here. Obviously, in a real scenario, there would probably be a lot more fields than this. Let's take a preview of what I got in there so far. So I have 10 accounts with name, state, and made up phone numbers. So the goal of the integration that we're going to build here is to take this table and transform it into this table. And this could be a scheduled thing, could be a one-time import or a manual one. And one other thing I do want to say is I've already gone ahead and set up the service account here for this integration. So I'll put a link in the description to the other video I made where I went over how to create the JWT service account in Google Cloud here, and then have that set up in ServiceNow. So there's a couple different ways that we can get this data into ServiceNow. The first way would be to take an export of the database in like a CSV. And then we can take data sources and transform maps inside ServiceNow and transform that CSV to the accounts table. This would be good for if you were only going to do this one time. But for our use case, we want to kind of make sure, maybe once a day, check this table, import it, and see if we have any new accounts in BigQuery to create in ServiceNow. The other way would be to use IntegrationHub and Flow Designer. So IntegrationHub is basically a set of modules, plugins, spokes, functionality that ServiceNow provides for customers to install to communicate with external systems, and a few other functionality where other external systems can potentially communicate inside ServiceNow. There's a couple different tier or subscription models for IntegrationHub. I won't get into the real specifics about, if there's a cost associated with each one. There's also some transaction limits for each subscription. Please investigate that on yourself before you dig into this. There is this document here that, as of Utah, and the date's up at the top right of the document here, there's 3 different subscription models: IntegrationHub Starter, Professional, and Enterprise. And the way that this document is laid out is basically for IntegrationHub Starter, these are the spokes that you get with that subscription. These are the protocols So we can communicate or create actions using REST and SOAP. There's utilities down here and some features that are for this particular subscription model. The spokes that it provides here, and what a spoke is basically is a set of actions that potentially could communicate with an external system, or there might be some actions also that communicate with the internal database of ServiceNow. So it might create an incident, it might update an incident, or other custom tables that might come with these spokes after you install them. Some examples here we have on the screen is PagerDuty. If your company has that, there's the potential to communicate with that system. Slack, maybe post an alert to a channel when an incident's updated. So there's a very light amount of spokes here that come with the starter. If we move down in this document, it moves on to the professional subscription. And there's a lot more spokes that are available with the professional subscription. We have some Google applications here, a lot of Microsoft applications. So Microsoft AD, there's the potential to create an account in AD, update an account in AD, or even groups. Smartsheet. And then if we move down a little bit on this document, we see additional protocols that become available at this level. So PowerShell, you can write PowerShell scripts to do lots of different things. JDBC, so if you wanted to write a action that communicates with the database, there's the functionality there. And there's additional action steps here, JSON parser and XML parser. If we move down a little bit more, we move into the enterprise subscription model. And we have a lot of spokes here. I'm not going to read them all off here. There's some SCCM stuff here, Amazon, Jira, SAP, and lots of different SAP stuff here. Workday Financials, Udemy. And then we do gain a few other features, data stream actions. So I was at the beginning of this video, I explained that this would be another way that we could get data into ServiceNow, but this is available at the enterprise level, and we're going to just build our integration today with the starter subscription model. REST API trigger, so this allows you to build flows that are triggered from a REST endpoint call. So you can build a REST endpoint in ServiceNow, and when an external system calls that REST endpoint, it then triggers the flow that you define to potentially consume data that is in the call. And then there's some flow templates and apps here that also come with the enterprise. The second part is Flow Designer, and Flow Designer is ServiceNow's replacement for the legacy workflow graphical editor. And it's meant to be read in more of a natural language for non-technical users. So let's jump over to ServiceNow and take a quick look at what that looks like. So if you type Flow in the filter navigator, we have Flow Designer here. And up at the top here, we have flows, subflows, actions, which we're going to go down and build through all of these later in the video and tie them all together. We have executions here. What this is basically flows or subflows or actions that have already been triggered, and it's kind of a log view of what happened in the flow, what variables were populated and stuff like that, which we'll also look into later in this video. Connections are credential and connection aliases, the connections that you define, and again, I'll have a link in the description for a different video where I set up that credential and connection alias. Let's jump into let's just create a new one here. We'll create a new flow, and I'll just high level go over what this looks like. So the basics of a flow is you have a trigger up at the top, and these can be all sorts of different things. So we have where a record in ServiceNow is created, updated, or both. We can have it scheduled. So do we want a flow to trigger every day at 1 o'clock? We could have that. Run once, you could just say at this date and time, run it once, or repeat, kind of similar to the top up here. And then you can have inbound emails trigger flows. If you have enterprise, the other option of REST endpoint or REST API will show up here. And then the service catalog. So if somebody submits a request, what do you want to happen? Approvals, tasks created in ServiceNow and stuff like that. So that's the service catalog. So if we just grab created here, you can say when an incident is created. You can put additional conditions on this. Only incidents with this specific category trigger this flow, or all sorts of things that variables that are on that record. After you define what's going to trigger it, then you define what the steps are. So there's a lot of different out-of-box functionality here. You can look up a record. You can wait for a specific condition to happen in ServiceNow. You can create records, send emails. There's depending upon what other modules you have in ServiceNow, there may be additional stuff here. If you have IntegrationHub or the different subscription levels in IntegrationHub, a lot of different stuff is going to show up here. Like Microsoft AD, I may have the professional version already installed on this PDI. Then you have some flow logic options here. So if this variable or this record's value is this, then go down this path. You can do for eaches, else ifs, do the following until, do the following in parallel. You can call a workflow. So the legacy workflows you can call from Flow Designer. You can also do, so in flows you can have flow variables, so you can set those flow variables at a specific time in the flow. At the beginning, if a certain value equals this. And then you have the option to call subflows from this flow specifically. That's on the right here. We have the variables that will show up depending upon what different actions you set up here. So for example, if we wanted to look up the incident, so we have the trigger variables up here. So it's the incident that triggered this workflow, and this will dynamically change depending upon your trigger. So let's say we wanted to look up this incident. You would select the incident table here, and you can do, where sysid is, and you could just pull the sysid off of the variables that are available for this particular incident record. And there's some other options here that you can set. And now we have two different, it's going to be the same incident in this case, but we have the one that triggered it and the record that we looked up here. And then there's the save, which doesn't publish it, I guess you could say. And then activate, which is pretty much the publish functionality. The one thing that's kind of different from the legacy workflow is in the legacy workflow, you could modify a workflow and it wouldn't take effect for other people triggering the workflow. It would only take effect, if you triggered the workflow in your specific instance, you would be using the workflow that you're modifying, not the original one, while everybody else would be using the original one until you published it. With Flow Designer, it's different. So there is, no matter what you do on this workflow, you can save it as many times as you want. It will not be the one that's being triggered until you activate it. There is this test functionality here where you can specify the input for the trigger. We chose incident created, so it's going to give us, select a specific incident in the system, and you can run a test on that incident. It will actively change data in the system if you are changing data in the flow. So if you, for example, took that incident, added comments, or created tasks, that will actively happen. So be careful if you're running this in a production environment when you run the test flow, because you will be modifying data. All right, so the first thing I do normally for integrations before I start building anything in ServiceNow, I go look up the documentation for this API, or hopefully somebody provides me with some documentation. We're going to be doing Google BigQuery. So we can look up their documentation. Thankfully, they do have documentation. Navigate there. Let's see. And then just kind of review it. If you know which endpoints you're going to use, review those. If you don't know which endpoints you're going to use, dig it through the documentation, or even ask the person that might be an expert on the client side that you're working for, or if you have somebody in your business that works on that particular application, they might have some reference on which of these words here makes sense and what you should use. So what we want to do is get data out of the database. So there's a couple different ways that they handle this, is through jobs. And we can do one of the three here: query, get query results, and get. I won't go into too much details on these yet. We are going to leverage the query in this video, but there is the option here to submit a job, wait for that job to finish, and then get the results back. So if you have a query that's going to take a long time, then there's the option to kind of poll to see if it's finished, and then get the results back after it's finished. Our result set is very small, and we are just going to query and immediately get the results back. So now that we have the documentation, the next step that I usually do, again, before I start building in ServiceNow, is to try it out in Postman or another application if you prefer a different one. Build out the authentication piece so that I understand it and test to see if that authentication works, and then build an endpoint in Postman to make the call and see the data come back, so that I understand what components are needed for authentication, what components are needed for the REST endpoint to make the call, and then I can take that and translate it into ServiceNow. Now that we've reviewed the documentation, maybe we've tested the authentication and the REST endpoint in Postman, now we're ready to build in ServiceNow. So what we want to do is encapsulate or contain the code and the modules, the flow actions, and all of the authentication stuff in a scoped application. So we'll go ahead and start in Studio, and we'll go ahead and create a new application. And we'll enter our app name here. I'm not going to go with Google BigQuery Spoke because I've already done that in this instance and it may complain, but I will do demo. You can add a description here. You can add a logo. If you add a logo here, when you're in Flow Designer or other places in ServiceNow, the logo will show up there. So it's kind of nice to have the little logo showing up when you have it in the Flow Designer flows. Then you have scoped or global. We're going to put this under a scoped application, and there's not too much here you can do with this. You can't remove this endpoint here. you can change the end part of this if you wanted to make it shorter or a different acronym or something. So we could do demo Google BigQuery S and just leave it as that. So once we put or push create here, we're then faced with some other questions around, do you want to create any new roles, which at this time we're not, and then which format do you want to use for this app? We're just going to do classic. So let me go back one. Normally I don't proceed with the rest of this because I'm not, for like spokes and stuff, I'm not creating data tables. I'm not creating any mobile applications. I'm not creating any forms. The most I'll get out of this is maybe some properties, the connection credential alias, and the flow designer actions, subflows, and flows. So you have the option to continue with this, or you could do this continue in Studio. And normally for spokes, I do this. So at this point, we now have our scope for our custom application or our spoke. So here it is, the demo Google BigQuery spoke. You can continue in Studio. You can create the flows, the flow actions, the credential alias, all of that within Studio here. Normally I'll jump out of Studio and create stuff manually through Flow Designer. All of our creations will get captured in update sets. You also have the ability to do source control so that you could publish it to your other instances. The other option is to eventually publish it to ServiceNow's store so that other people can install it. For this video, we are just going to do everything in update sets. I do recommend that you go out and look at the other options for moving or publishing applications to the store, to your other instances, for purposes if you want to publish or not. Since we're not going to do source control and publish this to a store or anything, I'll show you how I normally set up update sets if I'm not doing those options here. So it's already dumped us into the correct application scope here. So we're in our demo Google BigQuery scope, and it automatically creates the default update set. What I like to do though is create an additional update set. We'll come here to update set. We'll create new. And it's in, make sure we're in the right scope. And I usually call this the initial update set. And I usually make that the current one. And let's grab it. There's our initial update set. Boom. Go back to the default one here. So let me back out of this search here. We have the two update sets. I'll jump into the default one. I like to use the default one for garbage or mistakes or whatever you want to call it. So if there's something I don't want to move when I move this initially, I will put it in the default update step. And then I will, this custom application record here, I will move it to the initial update set for our scope. And that leaves the default one empty in the beginning here until I start putting garbage into it. And then I have my initial update set as where I will house pretty much everything that I initially build. I want to talk high level over what I built in a previous video again that I'll link somewhere on the page or in the description. So we built out a credential here. So we have the Google JWT test credential. And this uses JWT to get an OAuth token. And I'll just click here to show that it works. So we completed that and we have a new token. The second thing I built was the JWT key, which is part of this credential, and the JWT provider, which uses that key, and the application registry for this. So there's a Google JWT test application registry. And this has the token URL in it. The grant type is JWT bearer. And then the OAuth entity profile, which is pointing to that JWT provider, which in then turn has the key attached to it. And then the credential references this entity profile. Another thing I built in the other video was the alias, connection and credential alias. So if we come here, we have the JWT test alias. And that we have a connection here, which then is pointing to the API host for BigQuery, along with it, and it includes the base path in it. And this has the credential attached to it. And later, when we start building out the actions, this credential and connection alias is what we're going to point to so that it can authenticate properly against the API. All right, let's build our first action. So we're going to open up Flow Designer. And we're going to jump over to the Actions tab. And we'll create a new action. And we'll give this a name. And make sure that we're in the correct application and have our update set correctly. We'll give this a name of query. We're not going to change any of the other stuff currently. We'll go ahead and submit that. So the way these actions flow is you have your inputs here, the data you want to pass into the action, and then you have your outputs. What is it going to output so that when you use this in a flow or if you call it manually, the data you can grab and the data you can put into it. So for our query, we know this is a post. One of the parameters in the URL to the endpoint is project ID. So we know we need project ID. So we'll go ahead and create an input for project ID. And we can leave this as a string, and we know this is mandatory. The second thing that we need is the query request, which is going to be in the request body when we put this post to the endpoint. You can dig down and try to figure out what data you need. I already know what we need for this, and it is just the query. We'll create another one called query. That also can be a string. So now we have the two mandatory inputs for this action. We can start defining out the steps that are going to happen in between the inputs and the outputs. So let's go ahead and build out our first step here, and it's going to be a script step because I want to build my payload that I'm going to send to the endpoint here in this script step. There's another step that you could potentially use, and I think this is the JSON builder step. I don't normally use that. So we'll create an input here, and we're going to take the query that we're passing in from the inputs. So I have a variable that'll be available in this script called query. And we'll go ahead and drag over the query from our input variables here. So it gets passed into the code and we can use it. So let's start building out our payload. So I'm going to build a JSON object that we're going to send to the payload. The first parameter that the API wants is the kind. And I've already looked this up in the documentation. I'm just going to put that in here. All right, and then the second is the query. And what we're going to do is take the inputs, which is the input variables up here, and the inputs are passed in up here. And we're going to grab our query parameter. And I'm going to throw a trim on it just to get rid of any white space around the outsides of it. And then we're going to add another parameter here that I've already looked up. I think I put that there. Get rid of that R. That is going to be a false. And then the last thing is to put it in our outputs, which I have not defined yet, but we're going to define one called payload. And it's going to be the stringified version of our object. So JSON.string by, and spell it right. And we'll put the payload in there. And now we can create our output variable called payload. So we have our input variable of query. We then write a script to take the query and put it into a JSON object, which is our payload. And then we output it on this particular step as payload. So we're now going to add a step to do the actual REST call to the endpoint. But if you come here and in the steps list, you're missing this REST and SOAP step here, you need to make sure that you have at least the IntegrationHub starter pack installed. If you do that, you can do that through, I think it's through the store, or at least the plugins application manager inside ServiceNow. For a PDI, you can come to your PDI page here, the developer.servicenow.com, and activate a plugin here. And you'll type IntegrationHub, or you'll attempt to integrate. And then you have the different packs here. So if you wanted to try out some of the spokes and the enterprise or professional tiers, you can do that, and the same with standard. We're just going to do this one here. So you'll click activate. I've already done this. It's working in the background still. So once that finishes, I'll come back to the video here and we'll continue on. All right, I just got an email that the plugin has finished installing. So I would close out of Flow Designer, make sure you save, and then go back into it so that the step now shows up in the step actions list. So let's jump over to our action again. And now we can add another step after our script step. And if we come down to the bottom now under integrations, we have the REST and SOAP steps. So for this one, we're going to use REST here. And just a quick note here, you can rename these in here. So if I came here, we could just say build payload. And this is run query. And then the first thing we can do here is set up the connection details. So this is where we're going to select our connection credential alias. So we come in here, we have the credential and connection alias that we defined earlier. And it'll set up the base URL based on the connection that is active in the connection and credential alias. So this is the base endpoint that's going to be used. And then down here, we can define out the rest of the endpoint along with the rest of the request details. So we have the ability to do some other stuff in here, like open API specification and stuff, but for now we'll just jump into the manually defined one. This is going to be the rest of the resource path that's tagged onto the base URL. And then you can choose which HTTP method that you want to do here. Then we know this is going to be a post, so we can select that now. And then you can add query parameters that would end up at the end of the endpoint, or additional headers that might be needed to use to make the call. So let's go ahead and finish out our resource path here. So jump back to the documentation. For the query request, we know we need the projects, the project ID, and then the queries path. So if we put that there, this is going to be blank here until we drag over the pill for our project ID. This can sometimes be tricky. I got it the first time. Sometimes you have to play around with it, delete it, and re-add it. There is an option in here to do some function calls against the pill data. So for example, if you wanted to do a string trim here, we could do that. And we'll apply that. So when it gets populated into the path here, it will do a trim on the project ID. And you can tell it's doing an additional function here because now the FX icon here is lit up in blue. We have our base URL. We have the rest of the resource path added onto that. I don't think there's an additional headers that we need for this because all of the authentication is going to be handled by the credential and connection alias. The next step is to, since we're doing a post, we have to put content in it. And you can do a few different options here. We're going to use text for this one, but you have binary, multi-part, and form URL encoded as options here also. And then we built out our payload in the step before this. So under the build payload step, here's our output. You can just drag it right into there. And there's some additional stuff that you can do down here for retry and response handling. So let's go ahead and save this. And now we'll move on to test. So if we come in here and we click on the test button here, we can input a project ID and a query. So let's come over to our Google console here, and we'll jump into BigQuery. Let's find our project ID. So this weird black serious number here is our project ID. So we'll go ahead and copy that. And we'll get rid of the spaces. And then our query. So we're just going to do a select all now. So let's see if we can get this to. We want to do select all from the database table, limit 1000. We could just get rid of the endpoint of that. Go ahead and throw it in here. And I'm going to get rid of these backticks. Now let's go ahead and try it out. And then once this returns, we can see the results from it. So here's the kind of a log view of the action running. Come down here to steps. We can see that our inputs for the script step, the build payload script, we have our query. And we didn't pass project ID into that step. So, and then our output. So we can kind of see what we built from the inputs and then what was the output. So here's our payload that we're sending to the endpoint. Then our next step here is to run query, the rest step. And we can see the connection details up here. There's headers, we could see those. The response body that we sent, which is just the payload from the previous step, and the resource path. So we can see that it actually put our project ID in the resource path here. And then we can see the output of that step, which is the response body, which this is really what we want to see. It looks like we got a 200 status code down here, and then we have our data. One thing about BigQuery's data is we're gonna, instead of like a field value kind of pair return, it does this weird return where it has the fields, the field names or the column names up here in the fields section. And then in the rows, it has this weird setup of values. So each one of these is a column, and then each one of those is a row in the table. So the next step that we're going to have to do is take this response and turn it into something that we can use in ServiceNow. So we're going to have to write a script that kind of takes the fields up here and merges them with the rows down here. So let's move on to that. All right, so we tested the spoke so far. Now we need to run another script here to kind of parse the response data and handle errors. So I've already ran this twice now. So if we come up here to executions, we have the one where it was successful and I ran it again here. And what I passed into this was basically the same query, but I removed the star or the select all from the query so that I would get an error so that I know what the error return potentially looks like. You can also look at the documentation and hopefully they provide a decent explanation of what is returned in case of an error. So here's our response error here. So it's complaining that my select list must not be empty. So let's go ahead and build out the script to parse both the error and a successful response. So I'm going to come here and add a new step. And we're going to do another script step. We're going to do parse return. And we're going to have two variables for this. So we're going to have the response body and the status code. And in our run query here, we're going to have the response body, which we'll just drag right there, which is a string of the JSON returned, or nothing if nothing was returned. And then the status code, which is also a string. I went ahead and already wrote a script here, so we'll go over what that looks like here. And then I have our successful response and our error response here. Go ahead and post that in. Oh, I want to keep the function codes here. And I do want to remove stuff up here. All right. So let's walk through this script real quick. So I'm defining some variables up here that we're going to use at the end and populate throughout this script. So we have an error, the result, which is going to be an array of objects, the total rows returned, and then down here at the bottom, I have the outputs, taking those variables and populating them into the outputs. So we have our inputs defined, so inputs.status code and inputs.response body. Let's go ahead and define our outputs real quick while we're here. So we're going to have error, results. These are all going to be strings. Actually, we can make the total rows a number. And then total rows. All right, it looks correct. And we'll make this a number or int. Now let's walk through the script. So the first thing we do is we try to parse out the response body from a string to a JSON object. If that fails, we're going to log to the console or to the ServiceNow logs what happened, what the exception was. And then we're going to populate the EX, or the error, I'm sorry, variable. If we don't have any issues there, we'll proceed down here and check the status code. If there is a 200, which is the successful status code, we then move on to check if there is any rows returned. Is that 0? We'll skip over. If it's not 0, then we'll continue down this path. Well, one thing I did forget here, and we can add it while we're here, is total rows equals. Just take that, put that in there. And then what I'm doing here is I'm taking the response JSON. So let's take a look at it. We have this schema.fields, and then that's an array of the column types and names. All we care about right now is the name. So I'm using the map function on the fields array, and I'm taking the parameter off of that object name and returning it. So basically what I get is an array of column names. And this order here, so 0, 1, 2, is going to match the results of the rows here. So this would be 0, 1, 2. And that's consistent all the way through all of these objects here. So we have our mapping of column names. Next, we're going to loop through the rows and return an object. We're going to populate that object. So we'll loop through each of the rows, fields, or rows, and the columns here. I guess, I don't know, objects of values, and set the object property as the column name. So name, state, or phone number, and then make that equal to the value of the row object. So we'll get name, Artwave, or aware, state, Kentucky, phone, and then the phone number. And then we'll return that for each row. So we'll have the results is going to be a array of objects with their column names and the column values. If that's all successful, then we end up down here and we just output to the outputs. If we don't get a 200 status code, then I log to the logs again. And then I try to parse out the error message if there is one. And we can add something here. So if that's not successful, then we can just set the error equal to the response body as the last step so that we get something there if it's not a JSON response body that they sent. That's pretty much the script there. Next up, we're going to map those to the actual outputs of this action. Let's go ahead and save that. So let's go down to outputs, and we're going to create basically the same output that we have here: total rows, results, and error. So we're going to create we'll start with total rows. We'll make that an integer because that's what we're returning in the parse script. And we will create one called results. That'll be a string. In the previous script, I don't know if I called it out, but we're returning the stringified version of the array of objects. And then we have our error, which is just a string. Now we can exit the edit mode here and just drag our pills into their respective columns. I'll go ahead and save, and we'll test. So let's go grab all of our stuff here. We'll grab the project ID. the space up there. And then our query. Run test. Oh, there's an issue with our script here. So it'll tell you which step it failed at. So it looks like it's failing in our step 3 here. So let's jump over there. I'm going to copy this out so I don't have to go get it again. So step 3, it's complaining about this right here. Get out of there and save and test one more time. Get our project ID right here. So run that again. And it's completed. And up here, without jumping into the steps, if we have all of our output data mapped, you can come down here and see the output data from the whole action itself, along with the input data of the whole action itself. So we can already tell that we have data here. So we have our name, state, phone number, all mapped correctly in an array of objects here. So this is what we want. Let's test the other path now, an error path. So let's go back here and we'll go ahead and do the same error that we generated before. So we'll get rid of the select all. And we'll go ahead and see what our return is. So we see that the results are blank and our error message is what Google returned as the error in the result. One thing I did notice was that this was returning nothing. So we have blank value here. So the issue was that I'm expecting to put it in the output of total rows with a capital R, but this keeps lowercasing it. So what we're going to do is switch this to an underscore and switch this to an underscore. We'll save that and make sure it sticks this time. I'll go ahead and execute this one more time. This will actually give us our 10 this time, hopefully. Total rows not defined. Oop. I didn't mean to swap this one around. All right, so still did not give us our, just keeps changing it. What do we got? Total rows. Total rows. Let me exit out and come back in and make sure there's not some caching going on. Looks right. Looks right. Oh, let's double check that we're grabbing the right. Yeah. On the base. It is string though, so maybe it wants to do. I should have this in the try catch also, in case this throws an exception. But we'll leave it there for testing purposes right now. It's still not showing up. So I remembered what I had to do here. So I needed to, since I changed the variable name, to redrag it out here. And we'll just copy this 100 more times. Hopefully we'll get our 10 this time. There we go. Awesome. So now we'll move on to building out the subflow that's going to leverage this action. We put the results in a string here instead of like an array of objects, because this particular action could output different results depending upon what the query is passed in. So for example, if we pass in a query that queries a particular table, it's going to output a set of columns and values that may be different if we pass in a different table into the query. So I can't really define a output here that is consistent for this particular action. So for example, if we had an action, like the action was for a endpoint that always outputs the same array of objects or an object, we could put, an array of results here. And you have other options here to do array of strings or an array of object. And if you choose array of object, you could say this is an account for our account example. And then we can add parameters on those objects. So this would be name, and then state, and phone. And then when we can spell phone right. And then when we do our parse return, we would parse out an array of objects with that exact template and then drag and drop into this array of results. And then we could actually iterate through these array of results in the subflow or flow. So we're not going to be able to do that in this example here. And I'll show you a different way that we're going to go about getting these results into the data source and then the transform into the accounts table. All right, let's build our subflow. We'll come over here to subflow, create a new subflow, and we'll call this, actually, let's do this first. Let's jump out. Since this isn't really specific to the spoke that we are building, it's leveraging, the action that we built that's part of the spoke or the custom application. Since this is going to be a specific use case for the subflow, we're just going to leverage the action that we built and pretty much output the same stuff, but with our query in it. Let's jump out of our application here, go back to global, and we'll go to local update sets. We'll go ahead and create a new one. And we'll call this sync customer accounts. We'll jump back over here to go back to creating our subflow, and we'll call this get customer accounts from BigQuery. We're in the global scope here. One thing that's different from the action in this properties here is this run as. We'll also see that in the flow properties. And what this is who do we want to run the flow as? So we want to run it as the person who triggered it. So for example, if we were in the top flow if we triggered the flow off of an incident update, and that particular person would be the person that this would run as. If we select system user, then it would always run as basically a system administrator user. If you choose user who initiates the session and that particular person doesn't have the permission for the table that you might be running actions against, so for example, they can't create tasks in the incident table, or they can't create tasks in the service catalog task table, then it will error out and not complete the flow. So for this integration and for this particular use case, we want to use system user here. Shouldn't really be triggered by anybody else for this use case, but we're going to be scheduling this. Just wanted to let you know how that works. We'll go ahead and submit this. And up at the top here, we have inputs and outputs, kind of similar to the flow actions and then the actions. So this is where we're going to build out our flow here. So for inputs, for this use case, we don't have any inputs, but we have the ability here to kind of do something similar that we did with the actions, and that's allow values to be passed into the flow. And then we have outputs here. So for this flow, we're getting customer accounts from BigQuery. So we're basically going to take that action and run it with a specific query and output the same results. So we can do total rows. Do that as an int, a number, or no, it's an int in here. And we will have our results, which is going to stay as a string. And we will have our error if there's an error. The other thing that you have the ability to have in here is flow variables, and we're going to leverage this to store our query from a system property. So let's save here. One thing I need to do back on here too is in our query, we do need to make sure that this is published, or it will not show up in our actions list when we go to select it in the subflow or flow. We'll go ahead and publish the action query. Let's go ahead and create a variable to store the project ID and the query. So we'll have one for project ID, and we will have one for, we'll call it BigQuery. We'll call it customer account query. Both of these are strings. We'll go ahead and close that out. We now have those variables. They're blank until we set them, available in the pill data selector over here. Let's go ahead and create the properties. And we'll call the first one, we'll just give it the CSM namespace, custom account project ID. And I will have to go look up that table. Actually, we can do that real quick. Jump over here to execution. Yeah, fun. I think we might have to go look it up on the actual table. I'll grab that here in a second. So for now, we'll leave this blank. That's 2BD. And then we'll create another variable. Or a property, I'm sorry. Call it the same, but we'll name it query. Well, CSM custom account query. All right. So let me go grab that project query real quick here. Okay. I have my query and my project ID. So in the query, we'll store our query and we'll get rid of these backticks here. And we will say select all from our project and then table. We'll update that one. We'll go over here, put our project ID in there. We have our two properties here. So let's go ahead and populate it in our flow. And to do that, what we're going to do is there is a action called, or a flow logic. In the flow logic section, there's set flow variables. And we're going to have two of these here, one for the project ID and one for the customer account query. So you could set flow variables through other pill data variables by just dragging and dropping into these. But you also have the option to use JavaScript in here. So what we're going to do is just do return gs.getProperty. And this one's the project ID. And then for this one, return gs.getProperty. And that one is the query. So there's not much going on here yet, but we can at least test to make sure that these get populated properly. So if we run this now and we come here to set flow variables, we can see that the runtime values are being updated with the values from the properties. Now let's go ahead and add our action in here. So the first step here is to populate those flow variables that we set up. The next is to use our demo Google BigQuery or BigQuery spoke. We have the action in here now. That won't show unless you publish it at least once, and any changes won't execute in this flow unless it's saved and published over in the action itself. So here's the inputs for our action, which is project ID and query. So we can go ahead and just dropped in the wrong one. Populate these with that. And save and test again and see if our query comes back with what we want. Go ahead and run test. And then we'll click on view your test results. And we can see here that our results, there was no error. We have 10 rows and there's our counts. So the next step for this is to, totally exit out of it. I didn't want to do. Is to populate our output variables. So you could do additional logic here on the results from the query that are particular for this use case, which is get customer accounts, but we don't have anything. We're just going to pass it on through. So back to flow logic here, and we'll do assign subflow outputs. We'll just put them all in here. We're going to pass them right through. Done. Save. And now if we test one more time, we'll see it at the top level instead of the step-by-step. So up here in the Subflow inputs and outputs, we can see our outputs are outputting the results from the query. So let's go ahead and publish this so that we can use it in our flow. And we'll come back here to flows and we'll go ahead and create a new flow. And we'll call this the same thing. We can just call it sync count, customer accounts from BigQuery. Again, this is going to be in the global application because this is not something specific to our spoke that we built. And we're going to run this as a system user. And we're going to add a trigger here. So our trigger is going to be, we want to run this daily at, we'll just say 1 in the morning. And the first thing that we are going to do is run our Subflow. This is part of global. We'll have to search for it. And we named it get customers accounts from BigQuery. Leave everything alone here. So this is going to, if we were to test this right now, it would run the Subflow and our results from the Subflow would be the string here. And this isn't something that we can loop through to kind of individually insert into the customer table or individually insert into the data transform table. So what we're going to have to build is a action, and this we're going to build a generic action here that takes data in JSON format and allows you to input the transform table that you, or the import set table that you want to import the data into to be then transformed into a table. So let's go ahead and save this as this. Then we'll jump over and create a new action that's going to ingest this result, this JSON string here, and turn it into import set or import set table into the import set table, and then into the customer accounts table. So let's go ahead and create a new action here, and we're going to call this JSON to import set table and trans. And we'll leave all of the rest of this the same. And we'll create a new import called destination import set table. So this is where the data is going to go before it's transformed. And this is going to be a reference to the table, this DB object table here. Make that mandatory. Let's see if we can put a condition on this called extends table is import set. Maybe it won't let me. We'll come back to that. We want to see if we can limit it to only tables that extend the import set table. And then our next input will be the JSON string or array. And that's mandatory. Let's see if we can set. We'll just leave that blank for now. And then we'll have, what we're going to do is do a field mapping. So what we want to say is what JSON property goes to what import set table column. So we'll have a field maps table here, and this can be, we'll do an array of object, and we'll make this mandatory, and the first row here is going to be the object itself, will be the field map. First property will be let's do the JSON attribute name. And the second attribute will be the import set table field name. Get some lowercase going on in here. Do not like the capital letters that they automatically populate in here. All right, so we have the field maps, and then I'm going to add an option in here, a Boolean option, to say transform data, so that we can say true or false. Do we want this to transform the data, or just load into the import set table? So now we have our action inputs, so we can save this. And if we were to press, it's not going to let us test yet. We have to have at least one step here, and that's going to be a script step. So let's just add that in and save. And then I want to see what these inputs look like. So we'll select we haven't created the table yet, but we'll create an import set table that's going to house the data before it transforms in there. So we'll be able to select the table. And then this will be the JSON string, so it'll be an array of objects. And then we have our true false here, and then our field map. So we can say the JSON attribute name goes from the name field to the uname field, and then the state field goes to the useState field in the import set table. So then once we get the script step built out, we can go ahead and test this. So our inputs look good. So let's move on to the script here. Okay, I went ahead and built out the script here, and I'm going to walk through everything real quick. So I've defined some input variables here at the beginning of the script step. So we'll go ahead and just drag in those from the input variables. So we have the destination, which this can be set to, I think, just the record itself, because we want the record, not the table name. And then the data, which will be the transform data. Oh, sorry, not that one, JSON string. This is the data that we're going to process. The mappings, and then the transform data. So do we want to transform it into the respective tables, or just leave it in the import set table? There's this additional variable I defined here called logging, and I haven't created the input variables yet. So let's go ahead and do that real quick, and I'll explain what that one's going to be for. This is going to be for true false. And then we can go ahead and drag it in here. So let's take a look at our script that I pre-wrote and populated in here. We have some stuff up at the top here that we're going to end up outputting at the end. So we have rows imported. How many rows did we import? And was there any error messages? And then this section here is defining some variables around logging for this particular script. So I just kind of wanted to make it consistent for this script at least. And again, some of this stuff could be stored in variable or properties, system properties. So instead of setting it up here in the inputs, we could have a system property that says, log for the entire spoke, or for the entire group of actions, or whatever we're building here. but for now I just did it in an input as a variable. And what we do here is I created a function that I'm going to use throughout the script here called log. It takes in the message, and if our inputs.logging is true, then we will go ahead and log the prefix plus the message that we pass in. So all of our log statements are going to kind of be formatted the same and to be easily identifiable. Next, we break into our try-catch block since we're going to be working with JSON parse. Here's some logging up here at the top. The field mappings I'm just stringifying out so that we can see them. And then the data that we're going to be processing, I truncated it down to about 500 lines in case it's a large JSON file or JSON array. Then we go ahead and parse our data into an actual JSON object. And then we're doing some checking here. Do we actually have an object here? Is this variable defined? Is it an array? Because we need it to be an array. And is the index greater than 0? Is the length? And if it is, it passes all of those checks, then we have a import set that we are going to create. I gave it some definitions here, the short description. And then the name of the table that we passed in as our destination import set. And then we get back an import set ID that we're going to use here in a second. We have our import set created. Now we're going to loop through the data and create an import set row. And it's going to be in that table that is the destination import set table. This isn't the destination of the data, but the destination of the data into the staging table. We'll go ahead and set the sys import set field to the import set ID that we created. I'm just defining the row here so I don't have to keep calling JSON parse I. And then we're going to loop through the mappings. And we'll have two variables here, the import set field name and the JSON attribute name. We then take a look at the import set row table or the import set table and verify that the import field name that off of the mappings is a valid field, and that we have the actual property from on the data that we're being passed in of the JSON attribute name. So for example, if we have state, does this exist? If we have it in our mapping, does it exist on the object that we are parsing? If both of those check out, then we set the import set row field value to the value from the JSON object. Once we've looped through all the mappings and populated the iset row, the import set row, we then insert that into the table. So we loop through all of the data, we fill out the import set rows, and then if we have this set to true, the transform data set to true, then we use the glide import set API, the glide import log API, and the glide import set transformer API. And we transform all maps that are defined for that import set table. If it's not set to true, then we just move on. We don't transform the data, and you can see that data in the table. If this line 20 here doesn't pass, then we come down here to the else statement and we fill out error message, and we also log it to the console or the log in ServiceNow. If there's an issue with the try catch, we do a similar thing where we log the exception or we populate the error message and we populate the error message with the exception. After we get through all of this code, we then populate our output variables, our rows imported, which is, did I call that? Oh yeah, here. We're incrementing right here. And then we populate error message if there was any. And then we have our output variables down here to find out. And we can go ahead and create our output variables for the action here. So we're going to have our rows imported as an int, and our error message as a string. Go ahead and exit out of the edit mode and drag these on over from the previous step. And we can go ahead and save. And then we'll go ahead and publish this also. Before we test this, we are going to have to create an import set table to put the data into. And then we'll eventually have to create the transforms that transform the data. So let's go ahead and come back here to tables. And we'll go ahead and create a new import set table. And we'll call this customer accounts, or we'll call it BigQuery customer account. You don't need any of that. And it's going to extend the import set row table. And we'll go ahead and we'll just leave everything alone, I think, for now. We'll just go ahead and open this up. And we need this, I think, so that we can see it in the input box there. Let's go ahead and save that. And we'll go ahead and create our 3 fields that we already know that we're going to need. And make sure they're not already on here. Or something that we can use that's out of box now. So we're going to have name, state, and phone number. So we'll just make 3 string fields here. So we'll call this one name. We'll just do 2 to 55. We'll submit that. Create another one called state. Probably get away with 40 characters for that one. I think I clicked no. Maybe not. There we go. And then we'll go with phone number, which we'll just do another string for now. Phone. And we'll just do 40 also, even though we'll never use that much. All right, we have our import set table, and we have our 3 columns created on it. So let's go ahead and test our action now. So we'll come back here. Let's go get the data first from a previous Subflow run. So we have our get customer accounts here, Subflow. We can come over here to executions, grab the last one we ran, and just grab the data from the end result here. Grab that. Come back to our action. We'll create, did not mean to do that. Hit test. And we'll do BigQuery customer accounts. There's our import set table. Our JSON string, we'll just pop that in there. And let's create our field map. So we have 3 of them. We have name as the JSON attribute and uname as the table field name. We have state and phone. State and phone, phone. We're not going to transform the data this time, but we will enable logging to see how that runs. So we can go ahead and run. And once this completes, we'll go ahead and look at what happened. So it says we had 10 rows imported, no error messages. And if we jump over to this table and look at the records in it, we have 10 records. So let's jump into this and we see that our data is not populated. So let's troubleshoot that. We'll come back to the flow designer. Close all this out for now. And let's take a look at our script. All right, so let's take a look here. So this, we need to make sure these are the same name. I may not have named them the same. So we have import field name and JSON attribute name. Let's jump over to our inputs and we have JSON attribute name, but our name here is wrong. So let me copy this and we'll just update our script. And then we'll publish that. We'll go ahead and test this one more time. So let me grab the string of data here. Grab that. And go ahead and paste this all in here. I'll quickly do this. So we have name, state, state, and phone, phone. Turn logging on again, and we'll go ahead and populate this properly. Run that. And we'll still got the same result, and we'll jump to our table again. Actually, it's right here, so we'll just refresh this. And we'll filter out this for now. We should have 10 with the name, phone number, and state. So we have our data in the import set table. And the next step would be to build out the transform map and then put it all together in a flow. So let's go look at our logging statements real quick too. I want to see those, make sure they're properly logging since we did check mark it. We do have some log statements here. With our prefix in front, and there's our JSON. And then this is our mappings. And I think that was all we logged out for right now. So that's working okay. And then let's go ahead and build out our transform. Build out our transform. We'll create a new one here. And we'll call this BQ, BQ accounts to customer accounts. We're going to map our import set table to our customer account table. And we can leave everything else alone here. And we're just going to map 3 fields. So we will have our source field is name. Target field is, I think, also name. And we're going to use this as the coalesce. We'll go ahead and do that for state and phone number too. Just going to keep it simple for now. And one more. Phone. All right. So let's go test our action one more time, but this time with it on. It should already be open. Yep, so I'll show one more thing real quick before we do that. So if we come here to import sets, we'll see our import set here that was loaded. Oh, going backwards. Loading. It's not complete because we never transformed it. So these are all just sitting in a pending state here. So if we come over here, we check mark transform data this time, and we run the test. Should be able to come to our import sets, and we have another one here that's been processed. And we can see it inserted 10 different accounts into the customer account table. So if we come over here to customer account, we get rid of that. We have 10 accounts in here. And we can jump into one of these to see the state, make sure that's being populated. And it is. So let's go ahead and delete these out because we want to test it in the whole flow. So let's go populate the rest of our flow. Come back to Flow Designer. And let's go ahead and that's published. We'll jump over to our flows. And we are already running the get customer accounts from BigQuery. So that gets our data. So now we have our new action to add in here. Part of global. And we can search JSON. Pull that in here. And we could set these with properties if needed. Let's go ahead and do this manually for now. For JSON string is going to be the results from that previous subflow. Field maps we're going to find out. We do want it to transform data, and we'll just turn on logging for now. We have our 3 fields. And name. Oop. Case, it is case sensitive, so we do have to be careful about that. Date, keep doing it. And phone. We have our action populated. The one thing we can add in here is a if statement. Do something like if total rows is 0 or error is not blank, then we can do a log here, or we could create a task for somebody to take a look at why we're not getting anything back or why we have an error. For now, I'm just going to log to the console. Oop. We'll just do this an error. and we want to stop the flow. We don't want to proceed on. We don't put this here, it's just going to run this anyways. We want it to go to the log statement and completely stop the flow and not try to transform that data. So at this point, our flow is complete, and we could, so this will run every day at 1 a.m. So if we hit activate now, this will run. And at this point, we don't have to do anything but run it. So we can go ahead and hit test. And let me come over here and show that this table is empty. And we'll go ahead and run the test. We'll come back here and go back one. And we'll refresh this. Let's go in here and see what happened. Why did it evaluate true? Oh, we did get an error back. Let me take a look at our query. Updated. What are we running differently that we were not running before? Just make sure we have all this properly and put it in here. Yeah, that looks right. And then our query. Oh, wait. This is from the one that didn't work. So go back to our executions and go to a previous one before that. That one was just ran a second ago. 359819 with a bunch of dashes. Yep, 359819. Jump here, check our query. Select all from. Yeah, it looks the same. Step down and do it a little bit more. So to debug this, so you can see the if statement, what happened here, what the condition was, and what it resolved to, but you can also jump down into the subflow. So we can see we have the variables were set based on the scripts that we wrote from the properties. And then we can jump into the actual query, which is executing against our spoke. And then you can see the result here. So we got not found table, not found in location US. So let me go ahead and jump over to BigQuery and see what's going on there. So I jumped over to BigQuery. It looks like our table got deleted, and this is a free plan. So it may have expired. So I'm going to go ahead and recreate the table real quick, and we'll be back. So I went ahead and created the table again and added some new data to that table. So let's go ahead and run our flow one more time. And this time it skipped over the if statement. And if we come here to our import sets, we should have a new record. We can come in here and look at that real quick. And there's our new target records, our accounts. And if we come to accounts, we can see that we have our 10 new accounts in there. So if we come over here and we add a new account, let's take all this out of here. So let's say it's the next day and overnight a new account came in. We'll call this new account test. Run that. The next day, our flow will run again. So we're going to manually trigger that. So run. Once that comes back, we can look at our import set row. And we should still have 10 records processed, but only one inserted. So if we come back here, we should have 11 accounts now with our new account test. And we can verify the state came in here for that one. It did. So that's how we can incorporate the actions, the BigQuery spoke action that we built out, the subflow that uses that action, and then the flow that uses that subflow that's scheduled on a daily basis to get data out of BigQuery and to a customer or into a table inside ServiceNow. I called out a couple other ways of getting data into data source or import set tables in the beginning of this, and one of them was the REST data sources, and the other one was the data stream data sources. If you come to data sources and you create a new data source, you'll have the format here, and you can choose, type, and you can choose the REST integration hub option here, and you can say what kind of format that data is going to come back in. So if it was just a JSON object, you can specify that. There's a little bit of customization that you can do here, but it's pretty solid in how you define these out. You'll choose an action here. So for example, if it was our BigQuery query spoke, we could choose that here. And then there's the option to support pagination. But again, this is limited. So if your pagination uses a different way on how it returns the next page, there's not too much customization you can do here with that. The one that's different that has more options in pagination is the data stream data sources. So if you have the enterprise plugin installed, there'll be another option here where you can choose that and do a little bit more customization. Just want to touch on that real quick, but again, thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed, you can. I will be releasing additional videos. It's not going to be the quickest thing, so if you subscribe, you'll at least see them show up as I create them. Have a great one.